Okay, we are ready to tackle validation, which is pretty fun. So if I switch over to Articles Controller, this is where we left off. The only difference is that I've added some doc blocks to the various methods. This is a good habit to get into. And luckily, if you use something like PHP Storm, they can automate this process. All right, so let's head down to the store method. This is what we need to focus on. So if you remember, in its current state, we could submit this form and no error would be thrown. We try it, and a new row has been entered into the database table, and we're echoing it out, but there's nothing there. This is a very bad thing. So instead, we're going to leverage validation to ensure that these sorts of things never happen. So let's tackle that now. But real quick, let's do a select star from articles, and I'm going to delete from articles where the ID equals 7, just to start from scratch. Okay, let's get into it. Now, I'm going to show you two different ways to handle this. One is through using what we call a form request class and object. This is really nice for more complex validation. But you'll also have things where it's very simple. You just want to make sure that the user does fill out a field or two, and then you can continue. And for those situations, we can take advantage of a trait that Laravel includes by default. So let's start with form requests. As you can imagine, we have a generator for that. So if I run PHP Artisan and we scroll up, you'll see this section right here, make request. Now, think of these classes as a way for the user to make some kind of request for your application, whether it's signing up or upgrading their subscription, or in this case, creating a new article. So why don't we try this out? Make a new form request. And we could call it create article or publish article or schedule, whatever sort of terminology your business uses. In this case, a simple CRUD approach is fine. Now, a lot of people will add request to the end as a suffix. You can do that. You can leave it off. It's up to you. We'll keep it on here though. And that's it. So now we will switch back. And if I open up app, HTTP, requests, this is where those classes will be added. Now, this looks a little confusing at first, but actually it's very, very simple. So we have two different methods here, authorize and rules. The first one is, does the user have permission to perform this kind of request or action? Here's an example. What if somebody was trying to edit a comment that they didn't create? Well, of course, we don't want to allow that. John cannot edit a comment that was created by Jane. This is where we can add that sort of logic. Now, in our case, we don't even really have a membership system set up, so I'm going to set that to true. Anyone can make this request, currently. Next, we have our rules, and this is where we can add our terms, essentially, for the request. For example, if we go back to articles/create, we have a title, a body, and a published at. Okay, well, we can reference those exact names. Title will be required. Next, the body will be required as well, and our published at will be required as well. But maybe there's other things we need to do as well. For example, imagine you have a sign-up form, and your email field should be required, but it should also be of a specific type. It should look like an email address. And then maybe your name is required, but also it needs to be at least 2 characters long. And if you want to see a full massive list of what you can do, go to laravel.com/docs/validation. Now, why don't we add a couple more? We could either use the pipe here. So I could say required, and it should also be of a date type. So notice we use a pipe to separate them. Or if you'd prefer, you can use a general array. Either one works. Let's just stick with the pipe for now. Next, for the title, mostly just for fun, we'll say it needs to have a minimum length of 3 characters. How about that? Well, I can say min, colon, and then the minimum value. Think of this as our argument. So in our case, it should be at least 3 characters, so we can represent it like that. All right, so now we've set up our authorization, we've set up our validation rules. Let's switch back to our controller, and now all we're going to do is type hint it right here. Create article request. And we'll call it request. Okay, so we can leave it like this, or we can import the class at the top and clean things up just a little bit. and then we will update our doc block. Cool. So now here's a very important concept to understand. When we type into this form request, behind the scenes, Laravel is going to pick up on the fact that we are dealing with validation here, and it will automatically trigger the validation before this method actually gets executed. That's really important to understand. So in translation, what that means is the body of this method will never fire. We won't ever create an article unless our validation passed. Now, what happens if it failed? Well, for example, if the user doesn't enter anything in the title, the validation fails. This method never gets fired, and instead, we actually redirect to the previous page so that the user can try again. Okay, so before we try this out in the browser, let's go through the cycle once together. The user comes to the create page, and they fill out the various fields in the form. Now, when the form submits, we prepare to trigger this method. However, Laravel picks up on the fact that we've type hinted this object, and it's going to do its best to give us that object. However, in the process, it'll detect that this object can be validated, so it triggers that validation automatically for you. If validation passes, it gives us a request object, and we create the article. However, if validation passes, once again, this method never triggers, and we instead redirect to the previous route so that the user can correct their mistake from the form. So now, what I want you to notice is that we've implemented validation without adding a single line to this method body. So I can remove that. Next, we are receiving the request, so we no longer need to use the facade. I can just say request all, and that would be equivalent, which means at the top, we can remove that import right there. Okay, very clean. So why don't we try this out in the browser and see if it works? We will visit articles/create, and this time we will enter things. So enter, and the current date is fine. Add the article, and everything worked. So no issues there. But this time, we're going to try to submit the form without filling something in. Let's leave the body blank. Okay, well now I add article, and take a look. We didn't get redirected back to that main page. We just redirected back to this form because the validation failed. So that's what I mean when I say this all sort of happens automatically, which is cool. But we do have one problem. If the user makes a mistake, well, we didn't notify them what went wrong. So they really have no clue. And as you can imagine, for a big form, this is a problem. We need to give them some feedback. So why don't we fix that? We can do that by returning to our view, and why don't we display any validation errors right below the form? Now, here's the next important thing for you to understand. Your views will always have access to an errors variable. So to demonstrate that, if we were to var dump errors, let's just see what would happen. So we visit the page, and right now you can see it's an error bag. We didn't have to create that variable or pass it to the view. It was automatically done by Laravel. But right now, it's empty because we have no validation errors. But if we run this, now take a look. We ran the validation, it failed, it redirected back, it populated the error bag, and now you can see we have 2 errors here. So here's what we can do. We could say if we have any errors, this is nothing more than a helper method that lets us know if we have any errors. So if we do, and we'll end it at the bottom, then we want to display them. Why don't we use some Bootstrap classes? Alert and alert danger. Now I can say if we have any errors, then for each error as error, then display it within a list item, like so. And then finally, and for each, and we're done. Pretty easy. So let's try this one more time. We have no errors, so we display nothing. But next, we try to submit the form, and we do have errors, so you see them listed here. And it looks like our CSS is a little bit off, but you get the basic idea. The important thing is that the user has some feedback now. So maybe we fill out the title, but we leave the body blank. Let's add article, and now that works. And notice how the messages are dynamic. So let's say we fill out the body, and we fill out a title, so we handle the required validation rule, but we don't have enough characters. Remember, we set a minimum length. Well, now when we run it, it will still fail and the message will be updated accordingly. So once again, let's properly format this and we'll publish it today. And after we add the article, everything worked. So validation just isn't that hard in Laravel. But let me show you one last thing to finish up the lesson. We talked about form requests, which are pretty cool. They offer a nice, clean, dedicated place to put this stuff. However, if you don't want to bother creating a class, like I told you, we can also call a validate method directly on the controller. Let me show you what this looks like. If we take a look at the parent class and notice that we import this trait called validate'sRequest. And specifically, we have a validate method where you give it your request, you give it your rules, and it will essentially perform in the exact same way. So let's try this out. This time we come back here, and now we're not going to use create article request, we'll just use Laravel's general request. So let me import that at the top, illuminate HTTP request. We will update our doc block. And now we don't need a form request, we can just call validate directly on the controller. We give it the request. This will give us the information that the user typed into the form. And then we pass our validation rules, just like we did before, right here. So let's keep it very simple. Title is required and body is required. So like I said, for basic stuff, this is a nice way to go. It's quick and fast. All right, so now let's try this one out together. We will create a new article. I'm going to leave these blank, and we should get the exact same thing, and we do. So it's up to you to decide when each one is important. If you want, you could always use a form request and never call that validate method on your controller. Some people would say it's not the controller's job to handle that validation. Really, once again, it just depends upon context. What's cool though, is you can make up your own mind on this. So what we are going to do in this case, since we already created a create form request, I'm going to undo a few steps and bring it back to what we had before. Okay, so that looks good. Good job. In the next video, let's return to our views and talk a little bit about partials and how we can clean and dry up our code.